Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. Today I want to talk about a deck that I feel like isn't talked about that much anymore, and that of course is Crustle. This is one of those weird kind of decks that like has really bad matchups, but those bad matchups are very few, and for the most part it can just completely win certain matchups. It's a deck that's very powerful depending on how your run goes and what you get paired up against. So I really want to talk about it because we did have a top 32 finish at the Lille Regionals, which is, I want to say, Crustle's highest finish yet at a major tournament. So I think it's very interesting. I think this deck still has a lot of potential, and I do think we're seeing a lot of innovation, so I kind of want to talk about that a little bit. Like I mentioned, we did have a top 32 finish with the 23rd place. Alex managed to finish at a 10-3 record, and overall we had 10 players make day 2 with Crustle as their deck. So I would say pretty good overall. Very solid runs from Crustle. I know when Crustle kind of first became a deck over the summer, you know, we just saw a couple here and there at day 2s, but for the most part, Crustle's been doing pretty well at events. And if you don't know, Crustle's worst matchup by far is Gardevoir. It's also pretty bad against like Poltnor, I would say, but still, you know, pretty winnable, I would say, but definitely a much closer matchup. And aside from those two decks, for the most part, it does pretty good against everything else, except for like Explosion and stuff like that, but for the most part against the meta it does pretty decent, and that of course is because it has the mysterious Rock In ability, which prevents damage from all Pokemon EX attacks. So essentially most decks in the format use EX Pokemon to attack. If they don't use EX Pokemon, a lot of times they have single prizers that don't hit for as much, and with Crustle you have plenty of ways to heal that damage, and just to kind of wall things out and basically win the game over time by hitting for 120 each turn. And for certain matchups you do have the Cornerstone Mask Ogerpon, which prevents damage from attacks of Pokemon that have abilities. I will say with Cornerstone, I think it's very interesting moving forward. I do think that this card's not going to be as good in general just because we do have Kangaskhan now, so I feel like a lot of decks were kind of preparing for that. So, you know, kind of inadvertently kind of hurt this deck a little bit because this deck has always played Cornerstone for the most part, and so now, you know, people are preparing for this specific card because of Kangaskhan. So that means if they run into Crustle, then they're going to be prepared for it there as well. That being said, we do still have Crustle as a Pokemon, which still shuts down the majority of attackers in the format, so, you know, overall you're pretty much fine, but Cornerstone feels like it's a little bit worse now. Right here we do have Alex's 23rd place list. This is like pretty much the most straightforward Crustle, like as far as what you can expect out of Crustle right now, but what I really want to talk about in this video is just kind of all the different builds that we saw in top, I was gonna say top 10, out of the top 10 Crustle placing lists at Lille, just because they're all very different, so I think that's very interesting. But this right here I would say is kind of the most, you know, straightforward in the sense that you have Crustle, you got Munkidori, you have Cornerstone, Ogerpon. Those are your 3 Pokemon in this deck, and you've got a handful of supporters and items and things like that to kind of back you up there. We are playing the Practice Studio, we're playing the Reversal Energy. These are kind of just staple cards that you find in Crustle. The heavy count of Pokégear, just to be able to find the supporters that you need. I do also really like the Hilda in the deck. I think it's really good to find the Mist Energy, or Reversal, or Jet, or whatever you really kind of need, depending on what the turn is, right? I do think that the Hilda can be very useful in this deck. And of course we play 3 copies of Lux Cape, so very good in matchups that don't play Jamming Tower. So yeah, it basically makes Crustle unkillable unless you're able to kind of one-shot it, because you do also have the Poké Vital A to basically heal 150 damage, whatever it is, 100 damage, to basically ensure that you're going to survive for the most of the game. But I think what's really interesting about Crustle, one of the big, I guess, downsides is the fact that your Gardevoir matchup is essentially unwinnable. That's why a lot of people kind of stay away from this deck, because it feels really bad to have a deck that has an unwinnable matchup, especially when an unwinnable matchup is the best deck in the format, and you know, was pretty much one of the most popular decks at the previous regional. So it feels really bad to just kind of go into a matchup and say, hey, I've got no chance of winning this. But aside from Gardevoir and like Typhlosion, you pretty much have a good chance against everything else in the format. And as you can see right here, this was Alex's run. You know, round 1 going up against Gardevoir, starting off 0-1, losing to Gardevoir, and the rest of the day did not run into Gardevoir whatsoever and had a pretty solid run. The only losses were to Poltnor, which I kind of mentioned is already a bad matchup, but definitely more winnable. You do see that they also beat a Poltnor in round 2. They also beat a Poltzard in round 13. So definitely a winnable matchup, but just unfavored, I would say. And we see that right here, you know, losing to Gardevoir, losing to Poltnor, beating every single other deck in the room. So I do think that if you are able to dodge Gardevoir, you're going to have a good time. But I do want to also talk about some of these other Crustle builds that have a certain tech card to kind of deal with Gardevoir, just because I think that is definitely worth including if you're afraid of Gardevoir. One of the biggest buffs we did see in this deck from the Mega Evolution format is the Shuckle. This just in general is a good card for Crustle, which we kind of see in most of these, you know, day 2 decks for Crustle. It has a fermented juice ability, so if it has a grass energy attached to it, you get to heal 30 damage from one of your Pokemon each turn. This right here is a very nice card to just kind of gradually heal over time throughout the game. Again, if you're playing against a deck that doesn't really have a true answer to Crustle, you can basically slap Shuckle down and just heal over time and basically make it unwinnable for your opponent. So I do think that this is just a general buff to Crustle that's definitely worth including, which we see in a lot of these lists being played. I think Shuckle's really good for the deck, but the tech card I really want to talk about here is Ethan's Sudowoodo. And again, this is specifically for the Gardevoir matchup. I did previously make a video about Retreat Lock, so if you guys want to check that out, you know, feel free to check out my channel. You'll see it on there. But I do think that this right here is the card worth including for this deck, just to make your Gardevoir matchup a little bit more manageable. It does have Impound, which is Retreat Lock for 20 damage. But keep in mind that a lot of cards in Gardevoir resist fighting, which means you're doing no damage. So essentially you can just stall your opponent out. And right now Gardevoir, for the most part, is not playing any switch cards. It's not playing Professor's Turo. So if you're able to get something in the active spot that you could really lock for the rest of the game, you're essentially able to lock them out of the game and do no damage over time, so that way they can't hurt you with Munkidori, and they really have no way of knocking you out and winning the game. So you can at least force a tie if nothing else, or if you can deck your opponent out, you can just outright win. And this is the card to do that, and that's why we are starting to see this a little bit more in Crustle, to make that unwinnable matchup at least somewhat manageable, to hopefully at the very least force a tie. At the end of the day, if you run into Gardevoir, you know, all tournament long, you're gonna have a bad time. You're gonna do awful probably. But if you run into 1 or 2 Gardevoirs and you don't want that to ruin your run, this card can kind of prevent that and turn those into ties or potential wins, which would have otherwise just been outright losses. Like I said, we did have 10 players make day 2 with Crustle. I already went over Alex's build here, but I think it's very interesting because I think Crustle right now is one of those decks where it hasn't really been figured out. There is no set 60 or 58 cards for the deck. We're still seeing a lot of different builds when it comes to Crustle, so I do think that's one thing that's really going for the deck, is the fact that, you know, when you sit down and you play against Crustle, for the most part, it's going to be one of your matchups that you practice the least, let's be honest. How many times when you're running games online do you run into Crustle? Not very often. It's not like a Poltnor, a Gardevoir, a Grimmsnarl that you constantly run into, that you've kind of practiced that matchup. For a lot of players, Crustle is already kind of a strange matchup. You don't necessarily know all the cards in Crustle. And especially when we're seeing so many different builds, there's always going to be that element of surprise that kind of catches you off guard. So I do think Crustle is in a good spot because we don't have a set 60. We are seeing different types of lists. Like I mentioned, we went over the first place list, but right here is, you know, the second highest placing Crustle list. And we're seeing the Mega Absol, for example, and a heavier count of Munkidori. We're seeing the Yveltal for Retreat Lock. So we are seeing different things here. We got the Psyduck here to kind of help with the Poltnor matchup, which I think could definitely be worth it since you're already running the Mist Energy. This one's also playing the Secret Box. We got the XP share here as well, so we're seeing a lot of different cards kind of played here. I do think the Mega Absol is interesting. I don't know if it's worth including, but it can definitely help as far as certain matchups go, just to kind of give you an alternate way to win the game, essentially. We do have the Turbo Energize with the Secret Box, so I can imagine that for certain matchups, you want to just go ahead and power that thing up. And then for other matchups, you just don't want to use it whatsoever. So again, very interesting take here on Crustle. That was the second highest placing Crustle, still made a top 64 run, which is very impressive. This is the one that I think is interesting. This is going back to the original builds of Crustle, which ran the Iron Thorns EX. So what that does is it shuts off abilities for all Rule Box Pokemon. So basically all EX Pokemon don't have abilities now. Kind of going back to the original build of Crustle, even playing the Super Potion, which was originally in the build. So I think this one is very interesting as well, because we've kind of seen this one fall off the face of the earth. Like, we have not seen Iron Thorns whatsoever. So it's very interesting to see it come back here, and I do think it has some value right now with, you know, all the abilities kind of out there. Right here we see our Sudowoodo. We see it right here, also playing the Defiance Vest as well. And again, this right here kind of turns that unwinnable matchup, I feel like, into some potential. So when you go ahead and look at the matches that they played here, we do see they only ran into one Gardevoir, but we see that it was a tie. So again, it kind of gives you that ability to potentially, you know, tie or win a match that you otherwise would have lost. When we go back to the other ones here, this was the second highest placing one. They dodged Gardevoir entirely. So again, if you could dodge Gardevoir, you're going to have a good time. And then the other one here, looks like they also dodged Gardevoir. So same thing. If you dodge Gardevoir, you're going to have a good time. So we are kind of seeing that here. I think this is the one I just clicked on, right? Yeah, this was the one that tied. And then let's go to the next one here. Same thing here, playing the Sudowoodo, playing the Shuckle as well for that heal. Even the Picnic Basket, which I think is definitely kind of valuable if you just want to kind of clear damage off the board. So I do think that has some value. So same thing, playing the Sudowoodo here, ran into 3 Gardevoirs, actually 4. And we managed to force a tie, take a win against Gardejelly, and force another tie. So again, I do think this card has a lot of value for Crustle. And again, the reason why is because otherwise it's a pretty unwinnable matchup, I would say. Gardevoir has attackers like Screamtail, which can just do damage to you. They can easily get it back and keep doing damage faster than you can evolve. So I do think it's a pretty unwinnable matchup. Probably one of the worst matchups of the game right now for any deck, I feel like. But Sudowoodo basically helps make that manageable to where you could at least force a tie, but sometimes you can even outright win. So I do think the Sudowoodo right now is the MVP of this deck, and we are seeing that based off the results here. The decks that include Sudowoodo, for the most part, are tying. They're beating Gardevoirs, which is great to see. I think it's very interesting. This one has the Golduck, so I think it's kind of funny, like really kind of leaning into trying to beat Poltnor. So like in general right now, a lot of these like Dusknoir decks like Charizard and stuff, well, it's mostly Charizard that are playing the Klefki to shut off abilities. So by having the Golduck, you now have a stage 1 Pokemon with an ability, so Klefki does not work against it, so that's why we run the Golduck here. I don't really know that it's worth including at that point, but still very interesting, I think. And here we see another win against Gardevoir. We do see a loss to Gardejelly, which kind of makes sense too. I do think Gardejelly is probably going to be a worse time than Gardevoir, even though they're both pretty terrible. So it does kind of make sense. But yeah, it's just very interesting, I think. I think Crustle is in a very interesting spot where we're seeing a ton of different builds. Compared to most other decks where I feel like we've kind of figured out, you know, this is the list, like we're going to change a couple cards in the list. I feel like Crustle right now is in the spot where we're seeing a lot of creativity, and I do think moving forward there's still a lot more room for growth and for changes within the deck. With that being said, let me know what you guys think about Crustle right now in the meta. I do think it's a solid deck moving forward. Obviously, if you run into Gardevoir, you're going to have a bad time, but you can say that about a lot of decks, right? Like Mega Lucario still had a top 64 finish. A lot of people say Gardevoir is unwinnable for that deck. But we're still seeing way more Crustle being played, and I feel like Crustle against Gardevoir is more unwinnable unless you play the Sudowoodo. So I think right now it's just a solid deck. I think if you want to have a good time, you know, you can play Crustle. As long as you don't run into Gardevoir, you're gonna have an okay time. So yeah, I think it's just that one matchup that really kind of holds this deck back and kind of keeps it in check. But I do think for the most part, it's got a pretty good matchup spread across the board. But that's all I got for you guys. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll catch you all in the next one.